Her wedding dress cost more than her father's first house, yet it couldn't hide the truth trembling underneath it. That Amara was about to marry a stranger dressed as a savior, and only two people in that cathedral knew it. If you believe love should never wear a disguise, and truth deserves a seat at every altar, hit that like button and subscribe now. Only manipulators, liars, and people quietly cheering for Daniel would scroll past this story without joining the family who stands for honesty. Let's expose every wolf in a tailored suit, together. The morning light in Amara's hotel suite was the kind photographers dream about. Soft, golden, forgiving. It made her skin glow and her nerves invisible, which was convenient because everyone in the room needed her to look like a woman in love, not a woman being quietly buried alive in white silk. "Breathe," said her stylist, pinning the veil with the concentration of a bomb technician. "You look like you're about to give a TED talk on grief." Amara laughed, but it came out thin, like something stretched too far to hold its shape. Outside the window, downtown Atlanta hummed with its usual Saturday chaos. Brunch crowds, church bells competing with traffic. A city that had no idea it was about to host the unraveling of a very expensive lie. Her mother appeared in the doorway, clutching her phone like a rosary. "The governor's wife just texted. She's bringing her sister. That's 412 guests now, Amara. 412 people watching you become somebody." "I already am somebody," Amara said quietly. Her mother's smile flickered, the way smiles do when they're doing structural work they weren't built for. "You know what I mean. Security. Legacy. A husband who doesn't disappear when the money gets tight." "Ah, yes, Daniel. Handsome, tax bracket adjacent Daniel, who could charm a room full of skeptical donors into believing orphans personally thanked him in their prayers. Daniel, who once told a journalist that his charity work was just what decent men do. While somewhere across town, a woman named Grace was watching her own charity's bank account shrink like ice in July, wondering exactly which decent man was responsible. Because here's the part nobody in that bridal suite knew yet. Daniel's decency had a paper trail, and paper trails, unlike reputations, don't know how to lie convincingly under oath. 3 miles away, in a modest brick office that smelled like old coffee and older determination, Grace sat behind a desk buried in folders. She was 71 years old, wore a cardigan the color of forgotten Christmas ornaments, and had spent the last 6 months doing what powerful men hate most, paying attention. Beside her sat a leather folder, worn soft at the corners from being opened and closed 100 sleepless nights. Inside it, donor names that led nowhere, recipient families who had never received a cent, and photographs of Daniel shaking hands at galas funded by money that had quietly vanished into shell companies with names as forgettable as fog. Grace looked at the wedding invitation propped against her lamp. Amara's name, embossed in gold, smiled up at her like an old friend who didn't yet know she was in danger. "Well," Grace said to the empty room, in the voice of a woman who had made peace with inconvenient timing decades ago, "somebody has to ruin this wedding with the truth. Might as well be the old lady in the cardigan." Across town, in a guest bedroom too tastefully decorated to feel like home, Michael stood in front of a mirror adjusting a bow tie he didn't want to wear. He was 26 now, 2 years older than the day he'd first found that folder in his brother's office, 2 years deeper into a silence that had started to taste like rust in his mouth. He thought about the families in those photographs, the real ones, not the fake recipients Daniel invented for tax purposes, but the actual children who'd waited on a promised scholarship that never came, the shelter that closed its doors the same month Daniel bought a boat. Somewhere in his chest, something that had been dormant for 2 years finally, quietly, began to move. If you've ever watched someone build a beautiful life on top of other people's suffering and said nothing because speaking up felt too risky, you already know exactly how this story ends. Comment below. Would you have the courage Michael didn't have for 2 years? Only the Daniels of the world stay quiet and scroll past. By 10 a.m., the cathedral doors were open. Flowers spilled from every pew, like the building itself was trying to apologize in advance. Daniel stood at the altar, adjusting his cufflinks with the practiced calm of a man who had never once lost anything he wasn't willing to let go of on his own terms. He had no idea that an old woman in a mismatched cardigan was already 3 blocks away, folder in hand, walking toward the one truth his charm had never learned how to survive. The cathedral bells started their slow, ceremonial toll at exactly 10:45, and Amara stood behind the heavy oak doors listening to 412 strangers pretend they weren't checking their phones. Her father offered his arm the way men offer things they've already decided are non-negotiable: firm, proud, slightly oblivious. "You look like your mother did," he said, "on her wedding day." "Mom cried the whole morning," Amara said. "Exactly," he said, missing the point entirely. The way fathers sometimes do when tradition feels more comforting than truth. Inside, Daniel stood at the altar in his tailored charcoal suit, practicing his smile the way politicians practice handshakes. Warm enough to photograph well, hollow enough to survive a scandal. Beside him, his best man leaned in and whispered something that made Daniel chuckle, a low, easy sound that had convinced boardrooms, donors, and one particular bride that he was exactly who he claimed to be. What nobody in that cathedral knew was that charm, like cheap paint, only holds up until the weather changes. 3 blocks away, Grace's cab idled at a red light while she reread, for the 11th time, a photograph of Daniel shaking hands with a donor family whose home address turned out to be a parking garage in Marietta. She wasn't nervous. Women who've spent 40 years running a shoestring charity through recessions, betrayals, and one particularly aggressive raccoon infestation don't rattle easily. But her hands, folded over that worn leather folder, were tighter than usual. "You sure about this, Miss Grace?" asked the young man beside her. Isaiah, her assistant, 22, and permanently anxious since the day she'd hired him. "We could send this to the police instead." Quietly. "Quietly," Grace repeated, testing the word like it tasted wrong. "Isaiah, baby, quietly is how Daniel's been operating for 2 years. Quietly is how 43 families got promised help they never received. I think it's time somebody was loud." The light turned green. Back at the cathedral, Michael sat in the second pew, sweating through a suit that suddenly felt 2 sizes too formal for the weight he was carrying. His mother sat beside him, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, already crying happy tears for a marriage that hadn't happened yet. The kind of premature grief reserved for weddings and Christmas specials. "Isn't it wonderful?" she whispered, squeezing his hand. "Your brother finally settling down?" Michael managed a smile that felt like a muscle cramp. "Yeah, Mom. Wonderful." He thought about the folder he'd found 2 years ago, tucked behind tax documents in Daniel's home office. He thought about the shelter that closed. He thought about the specific way Daniel had looked at him afterward. Not angry, just disappointed. The way you're disappointed in a dog that's chewed a shoe. "You'd humiliate our parents for people you've never met?" He had believed for 2 years that silence was loyalty. Sitting in that pew, watching Amara's face when she finally appeared at the end of the aisle, luminous, terrified, doing her very best impression of a woman choosing this, Michael understood, with the sudden clarity of cold water, that silence had just been cowardice wearing a nicer outfit. The organ swelled. The doors opened. Amara walked forward on her father's arm, past faces glowing with borrowed joy, past flowers that had cost more than most people's rent, toward a man she was fairly certain she didn't love and absolutely certain she'd stopped trying to. Daniel watched her approach with the expression of a man admiring a car he'd already paid off. Not at her, at the moment. At the photographs this moment would produce. At the headline, "Philanthropist Daniel weds society's sweetheart." He had built an empire on optics, and this glittering, expensive, camera-ready ceremony was simply optics wearing a wedding dress. Amara reached the altar. The priest opened his book. Somewhere outside, a cab pulled up to the curb, and an elderly woman in a mismatched cardigan stepped out, leather folder tucked beneath her arm like a weapon she'd spent months sharpening. If you've ever stood at your own version of an altar, a job, a relationship, a family expectation, and felt your gut scream wrong while your mouth kept smiling, drop a comment below. Because Amara's about to learn what happens when the truth refuses to wait for a convenient exit. The priest cleared his throat. "Dearly beloved," he began, "we are gathered here today." And 3 blocks away had just become 1 block, then a hallway, then a set of massive wooden doors that were, at that exact moment, beginning to open. The doors didn't creak open so much as they exhaled, a long, deliberate groan of old wood that silenced 412 conversations mid-sentence. Every head turned. Every phone, mysteriously, stopped recording the ceremony and started recording whatever this was instead. Grace walked in first, moving slower than the moment probably wanted her to. One hand resting on Isaiah's arm, the other clutching the leather folder like it was the only thing keeping her upright. She wore the same cardigan she always wore, mismatched, slightly moth-eaten at one cuff, in a room full of $5,000 gowns and diamond cufflinks. It should have made her look small. Instead, it made everyone else's finery look like costume. "May I speak?" Grace said, her voice carrying with the strange, unhurried authority of someone who has genuinely stopped caring what people think of her timing before this marriage becomes a lifetime mistake. Somewhere in the third row, a woman in a peacock blue hat gasped loud enough to qualify as a sound effect. The priest, mid-blessing, blinked like a man who'd forgotten his lines. Daniel's smile didn't fall immediately. It cracked slowly, the way expensive porcelain cracks, quietly, along a fault line that had probably existed for years, waiting for the right amount of pressure. "I'm sorry," he said, recovering fast, flashing the smile that had gotten him out of board meetings, tax audits, and one memorable altercation with a jealous ex-girlfriend. "But I think you have the wrong wedding." "I have the right groom," Grace said. "Daniel Ashworth, founder of the Ashworth Family Foundation, recipient of last year's Atlanta Humanitarian Award." She said the word humanitarian the way you'd say a word you'd found stuck to the bottom of your shoe. "I run Grace's Hearth. Perhaps you remember writing us a check 3 years ago for $80,000, a check that never actually left your account." Gasps rippled through the pews like wine through wheat. Amara, still at the altar, felt her stomach fold in on itself. She turned to look at Grace properly for the first time. Really look. And something in her chest cracked open, memory flooding back like a door kicked in. Grace's Hearth. Saturday mornings. Finger painting with 6-year-olds who called her Miss Amara like she was somebody important. The place she'd loved before she'd been told, gently, that loving, it wasn't practical anymore. "Grace," Amara whispered. It wasn't a question. It was recognition. And recognition, in that moment, hurt more than confusion would have. Grace's eyes softened just slightly when they met Amara's. The only gentle thing that happened in the next 5 minutes. "Hello, baby girl. You look beautiful. I'm sorry it has to be today." "This is absurd," Daniel said, louder now, addressing the room instead of Grace, a politician pivoting to his base. "This woman is clearly upset about a business dispute. My foundation has audited books. We have fake books," Grace said, opening the folder with the calm precision of someone laying out a full house at a poker table. 43 families listed as recipients of your foundation's aid. I called every single one. Not one of them exists at the addresses you provided. One address? She pulled a photograph free, held it up so the nearest rows could see, is a parking garage on Roswell Road. The room, which had been holding its breath collectively, now released it in a wave of murmurs, phones angling upward. A photographer near the back actually climbing onto a pew for a better shot. Somewhere, a bridesmaid whispered, "Oh my God, is this a Dateline episode?" Which, under different circumstances, might have been funny. "Photographs prove nothing," Daniel snapped. And for the first time, a thin sheen of sweat had appeared along his hairline, undermining 3 years of carefully maintained composure. "They prove you shook hands with actors at your own galas," Grace said. "I paid 2 of them to talk. It's remarkable what people will admit for $400 and a guilty conscience." Amara's hands had begun to tremble, the bouquet shaking faintly in her grip like something alive and frightened. She thought of every unexplained late night, "The foundation's numbers are complicated, sweetheart. Don't worry about it." Every time Daniel had gently steered her away from asking questions she should have asked years ago. The puzzle pieces, scattered for 3 years across 100 small dismissals, were suddenly, violently, assembling themselves into a single, ugly picture. If you've ever ignored a red flag because the person waving it looked too good in a suit to be lying, you're not alone, and you're about to watch Amara learn the same lesson the hard way. Drop a comment. Have you ever found out the person you trusted most was the biggest liar in the room? The priest, still holding his ceremonial book like a life raft, looked between Grace, Daniel, and Amara, and made the extremely reasonable decision to say absolutely nothing. And that was when Michael stood up. Michael's chair scraped against the marble floor, a sound sharp enough to cut through the murmuring crowd like a blade through silk. Every head that had been fixed on Grace and Daniel now swiveled toward the second pew, toward the groom's own brother, standing with his hands shaking at his sides and his face the color of old ash. "Michael?" Daniel said, and for the first time all morning, something genuine slipped through the charm. Not warmth, but warning. A brother's warning, low and fast, the kind that says, sit back down without needing words. Michael didn't sit down. "I have to say something," he said, and his voice cracked on the word say, which made it, somehow, more believable than anything Daniel had said all morning. "I've had to say something for 2 years." His mother grabbed his sleeve. "Michael, honey, whatever this is, it can wait." "It can't, Mom." He gently pulled his arm free, and the gentleness of it broke something in her face faster than shouting would have. "It's waited long enough. I let it wait long enough." He turned to Amara first, because whatever else happened in the next 5 minutes, he owed her that. "2 years ago, I found a folder in Daniel's home office. Contracts, donor lists, names of families who were supposed to get scholarships, housing assistance, medical bills covered. None of it real. I confronted him. He told me I'd humiliate our parents for people I'd never met." He swallowed hard. "And I believed that mattered more than the truth. I told myself I was protecting the family. I was protecting him. And every day since, I've watched him build a life on top of people who actually needed that money. Real families, real kids. While I stayed quiet at every dinner, every gala, every toast to his generosity." "Michael, that's enough," Daniel said, stepping toward his brother now, voice dropping into the register he used for difficult clients. Calm, reasonable, faintly threatening. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Michael said. And something in him, something that had been folded small for 2 years, finally unfolded all the way. "Because I helped you hide it. I never told anyone. I let a shelter close. I let a scholarship fund disappear. I let you stand up here in a $5,000 suit and marry a woman who has no idea what she's actually signing up for." He looked at Amara, and his eyes were wet now, unashamed of it. "I'm sorry, Amara. I should have told you the moment I found out. I was a coward, and you paid for it. I'm done being one." The cathedral had gone fully, completely silent. The kind of silence that has weight, that presses against your eardrums. Even the photographer on the pew had lowered his camera, momentarily too stunned to document the thing he'd climbed up there to capture. Amara stood at the altar in her wedding dress, bouquet trembling in her hands, staring at the man she'd been about to marry as if seeing him, really seeing him, for the very first time. Every excuse came rushing back with terrible clarity. The missing receipts he'd waved off with a laugh, the late-night calls he'd taken in other rooms, the way he'd always changed the subject whenever she asked about the foundation's actual impact. She had mistaken his confidence for honesty. She had mistaken his polish for depth. The puzzle was finished now, and the picture it made was uglier than she'd let herself imagine. "Amara?" Daniel said, turning to her. And for one flickering moment his mask actually slipped all the way off. Not into anger, but into something closer to panic. The look of a man realizing the ground he'd built his entire life on had just been revealed as scaffolding over an empty lot. "I can explain everything. I love you. None of this changes that." Amara looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked past him, at Grace standing in the aisle with her worn folder, at Michael still trembling beside the pew, at 412 guests who had come to witness a wedding and were instead witnessing something far more valuable. The truth, arriving exactly on time, dressed in a mismatched cardigan and a borrowed suit. If you've ever had to choose between the comfortable lie and the terrifying truth, you already know how heavy that silence feels. Comment below. Do you think Michael's confession came too late or exactly on time? She reached up, slowly, and began to unpin her veil. The veil came free with a soft tug, and Amara held it for a moment in her hands, like something she was deciding whether to keep. Behind her, the priest still hadn't moved, still hadn't spoken, apparently having concluded, wisely, that this was no longer a ceremony he had any authority over. "Amara?" Daniel said again, softer this time, reaching for her hand. "Don't do this. Not here. Not in front of everyone." "You mean don't do this in front of the 400 people you invited so they could watch you look generous?" Amara said, and her voice, to her own surprise, didn't shake. That's the thing about optics, Daniel. They only work when nobody's holding a folder. A ripple of sound moved through the pews, somewhere between a laugh and a gasp. The sound of a room realizing it was allowed to react. In the fourth row, an older man in a bow tie muttered, "I told my wife something felt off about that foundation gala." To which his wife hissed, "Not now, Gerald." Amara turned to Grace, who stood in the aisle with the patience of a woman who had waited years for this exact moment and intended to enjoy every second of it responsibly. "You could have called me," Amara said. "Before all this, you could have told me quietly." "I thought about it," Grace admitted. "But quiet is how Daniel operated for 3 years, sweetheart. Quiet is how 43 families got forgotten. Some truths need witnesses, or the person telling them gets buried right along with the lie." She held up the folder slightly. "Besides, you deserve to hear it from the people who loved you enough to risk the scene." Amara looked at Michael next. He hadn't sat back down. He stood frozen in the aisle, still trembling, looking like a man who'd finally set down a boulder he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten what his shoulders felt like without it. "Thank you," she told him, and meant it, though gratitude tangled uncomfortably with the ache of knowing he'd known for 2 years and said nothing until the 11th hour of her life's biggest mistake. "I wish it hadn't taken you this long, but thank you." "I know," Michael said. "I know it's not enough. I'm going to spend a long time making it enough. To the families, if nowhere else." Daniel, watching his carefully constructed world dissolve in real time, tried one last angle, the one that had worked on donors, journalists, and his own mother for years. "This is a misunderstanding that's spiraling out of control. Grace has always resented how successful the foundation became. And Michael," his voice hardened, brotherly warmth curdling into something colder, "Michael has always wanted what I have." "I don't want what you have, Daniel," Michael said quietly. "I never did. I wanted you to actually deserve it." The line landed like a slap nobody saw coming, and even Daniel, for once, had nothing charming to throw back at it. Amara slid the engagement ring from her finger, a ring that had felt, from the very first day, slightly too heavy for what it was supposed to represent, and placed it in Daniel's open palm, closing his fingers around it gently, almost kindly, the way you'd hand something fragile back to a child who'd broken it once already. "I hope you find whatever it is you're actually chasing," she said, "because it was never me. I was just good scenery." She turned to the guests then, 412 faces frozen somewhere between scandal and secondhand heartbreak, and found, to her own surprise, that she wasn't ashamed. She was tired and shaking and about to cry in front of half of Atlanta's philanthropic elite, but she wasn't ashamed. "Thank you all for coming," she said, with the dry, exhausted humor of a woman who just watched her own funeral turn into a fraud trial. "I'm sure this wasn't the ceremony you were expecting. It certainly wasn't the one I was expecting either. But I'd rather you all know the truth today than send you a much more awkward save the date in 5 years when this would have ended the exact same way, just with more furniture involved." A surprised laugh broke somewhere near the back, then another, the tension in the room fracturing into something almost like relief. If you've ever had to hand back a ring, a title, or a life that looked perfect on paper because your gut finally outshouted your fear, comment below. Because Amara's about to learn that walking away from the wrong altar is sometimes the bravest vow anyone can make. She gathered the hem of her dress in one hand, looked once more at Grace, at the woman who'd waited years to give her back the truth she deserved, and began walking down the aisle, away from the altar, toward the doors still standing open at the far end of the cathedral, sunlight spilling through them like an invitation she finally intended to accept. The walk down the aisle away from the altar felt longer than the walk toward it had, though it was the same 40 feet of red carpet, the same 412 faces turned to watch her pass. This time, though, nobody was smiling for the cameras. This time, the silence had a different texture, not reverence, but the collective held breath of a room that had just watched a woman refuse to disappear into someone else's story. Amara reached the massive doors, paused on the threshold, and looked back once. Daniel stood frozen at the altar, the ring closed in his fist, his expensive suit suddenly looking less like armor and more like a costume somebody had forgotten to return. Grace watched her go with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who'd planted a seed years ago and finally lived to see it bloom at the worst possible moment for everyone except the person who mattered. Michael gave her a small nod, not an apology this time, just an acknowledgement, the kind exchanged between two people who'd both just done something terrifying and necessary. Then Amara turned and walked out into the Atlanta morning, and the doors swung shut behind her like a chapter closing on its own. Outside, the air smelled like rain that hadn't quite decided to fall yet. She stood on the top step in her wedding dress, veil forgotten somewhere inside, and let herself shake for exactly 30 seconds before she made herself stop. 30 seconds felt like the appropriate amount of time to fall apart in public. Any more than that, and the tabloids would have a field day with the photos, which, she noted grimly, someone was absolutely already taking from across the street. You did the right thing. She turned. Grace had followed her out, moving slower now that the adrenaline had worn thin. Isaiah hovering a respectful step behind with the folder tucked under his arm, like it weighed considerably less now that its job was done. Did I? Amara said. Because right now, it mostly just feels like I set my own life on fire in front of a live audience. Sometimes that's what the right thing feels like, Grace said. Burning down a house you never should have moved into in the first place. Better to do it before you've unpacked all your boxes. Despite everything, Amara laughed. A real laugh, cracked and surprised. The first one that had felt unrehearsed and longer than she wanted to admit. You waited years for this, didn't you? I waited for the right moment, Grace corrected gently. There's a difference. I didn't do this to hurt you, baby girl. I did it because you gave my shelter its very first donation, years ago, when you didn't have 2 nickels to rub together yourself, and you did it without wanting a single thank you card for it. People like that don't deserve to marry people like Daniel. It's bad math. Amara felt something crack open in her chest. Not grief this time, but something closer to being seen, fully, by someone who'd remembered a version of her she'd nearly forgotten existed. I don't even know what I'm supposed to do now, she admitted. I had a whole life planned out. A house, a registry, a 5-year anniversary trip to Santorini that I now assume is canceled. Now, Grace said, you get to find out who you are when nobody's deciding for you. That's not a tragedy, sweetheart. That's a Tuesday morning most people never get. Behind them, the cathedral doors opened again, and this time it was Michael, still in his dress shirt, tie loosened, jacket abandoned somewhere inside. He stopped a respectful few feet away, hands in his pockets, looking like a man who'd aged 5 years in the last 20 minutes. I know I don't get to ask for anything, he said, but I'm going to make this right. The families Daniel used, the shelter, all of it. I have documentation too. I'm turning everything over to the authorities this afternoon, testimony and all. I should have done it 2 years ago. I'm doing it now. If you believe accountability matters even when it's inconvenient, even when it costs you your own family, hit subscribe and drop a comment saying no more silence. Because only people still protecting their own Daniels stay quiet in the comments section. Amara studied him for a long moment. The brother who'd stayed silent too long, but who'd finally, publicly chosen the harder truth over the easier lie. Thank you, she said again, and this time it came easier. That's a start. Overhead, the clouds that had been gathering all morning finally broke apart, and a thin blade of sunlight cut across the cathedral steps, catching the edge of her abandoned wedding dress like the universe had decided, belatedly, to applaud. 6 months later, Amara stood in the small courtyard behind Grace's hearth, sleeves rolled up, paint on her hands instead of a wedding ring, watching a group of kids argue passionately about whether the mural's sun should be yellow or obviously orange. Miss Amara, the sun is orange. She'd learned, over the past half-year, to pick her battles. This was not one worth winning. The scandal had broken exactly the way scandals do in the age of phones with excellent cameras, fast, loud, and impossible to contain. By that evening, clips of Grace's entrance had already spread across every platform with captions like Grandma Inn's wedding with receipts and the vows nobody saw coming. By the next morning, 3 separate journalists had reached out to Amara for comment. She declined all of them, not out of shame, but because she'd finally understood something Grace had been trying to teach her for years. Some stories don't need an audience to be true. Daniel's foundation collapsed within weeks, buried under an investigation that Michael had personally handed to the district attorney's office, testimony and all. 43 falsified beneficiary files, 3 years of diverted donations, and a paper trail so thorough that even Daniel's lawyers had reportedly asked him, off the record, to stop talking. He'd lost the foundation, the humanitarian award, revoked in a press release so brief it barely qualified as one, and, according to the society pages, which Amara no longer read but somehow still heard about, most of his old golf partnerships. Charm, it turned out, had a shelf life once the receipts came out. Michael had testified against his own brother in a closed hearing that cost him his relationship with both parents for the better part of 4 months. His mother had eventually come around, arriving one Sunday at Grace's hearth unannounced, apron still on from a half-finished dinner, to tell him quietly that she was proud of him. 2 years too late, but not too late to matter. Michael now spent his weekends at the shelter too, mostly doing things Grace assigned him with the specific joy of a woman who'd found free labor with a guilty conscience. He was good with the kids. Better, if Amara was honest, than she'd expected. "You're doing it wrong," said a boy named Terrence, age 8, watching Amara paint. "The sun doesn't have that many rays. That's too many rays." "It's an artistic choice," Amara said. "It's a wrong choice," Terrence clarified, with the confidence of someone who had never once doubted himself. And Amara laughed so hard, she had to put the brush down. Grace watched from the porch steps, cardigan slightly less mismatched than usual. Isaiah had apparently staged an intervention, sipping tea from a mug that read "World's Okayest Philanthropist," a gift from the same staff who clearly adored her. She'd started calling Amara her unofficial deputy director 3 months ago, a title with no salary and considerable chaos, and Amara had accepted it faster than she'd accepted anything in years. "You know," Grace said, when Amara finally sat down beside her, wiping orange paint off her hands, "your mother called me last week." Amara raised an eyebrow. "Did she threaten you?" "She apologized," Grace said. "Took her long enough, but she did it. Said she'd been so busy planning your wedding, she forgot to ask if you actually wanted one." Grace took a slow sip of tea. "People do that. Confuse security with happiness. They're not roommates, sweetheart. They just look similar from far away." Amara looked out over the courtyard, the mural half finished, the kids still arguing about ray count and sun color with the seriousness of Supreme Court justices, the late afternoon light doing exactly what it had failed to do on her wedding morning. Feeling honest, warm, unforced. She thought about the woman she'd almost become, poised, photographed, quietly disappearing into someone else's press release, and felt no grief for her at all. Only relief, the particular kind that arrives late but complete, like a door finally closing on a room you'd outgrown years before you found the courage to leave it. "I used to think love was supposed to feel like sunlight," she said quietly. "Warm, unforced. I forgot that for a while." "And now?" Grace asked. Amara looked at the mural, at Terrence still fiercely defending his 14-ray sun, at Michael jogging up the path with a box of supplies, and an easy, unguarded laugh she hadn't heard from a man in longer than she wanted to admit. "Now," she said, "I remember.